The screaming had stopped. What replaced it was worse. A silence pressed down on Jerusalem, heavy as the black smoke twisting up into the July sky of AD 1099. The sun hung behind that smoke like a dying coal, dimmed by burning flesh and smoldering cedar beams. In the alleys below, only one sound carried. A wet, steady, methodical sound. The sound of men at work. Crusaders moved between corpses. Their mail, their surcoats, their beards were stiff with drying blood. They were not praying over the dead. They were cutting them open. Hands pushed into the still warm stomachs of fathers, mothers, infants. Searching. The defenders had swallowed gold coins before the breach, hoping to die with their wealth hidden inside them. The knights pulled the coins back out one by one. The gutters of Jerusalem did not carry water that day. They carried a slow red current. On the Temple Mount, the chroniclers wrote that the blood reached the horses' bridles, then the ankles, then higher. This was the holy destination, the journey's end, the city promised by God. What kind of pilgrimage finishes like this? What kind of men carve open children and believe heaven is watching with approval? The answer starts 4 years earlier. A field outside Clermont, France. November, AD 1095. Pope Urban II climbed onto a wooden platform and looked out at a sea of Frankish knights. And he saw an opportunity, dressed as a crisis. Europe was devouring itself. A whole generation of armored second sons had been locked out of inheritance by the law of primogeniture. Trained from boyhood to kill, given nothing to inherit. They were professional violence with nowhere to point itself, robbing pilgrims, burning villages, gutting each other in petty wars. Urban did not want to disarm them. He wanted to aim them. He looked at this restless herd of killers and saw a weapon. All it needed was a target. So he gave them one. East, Jerusalem. The Holy Sepulchre, he told them, was in pagan hands and only their swords could take it back. But sermons alone do not move armies across continents. Urban needed something stronger. So he offered them the thing no priest had ever offered before. Plenary indulgence. Not a small forgiveness. A total wipe. Every sin a man had committed, and every sin he was about to commit on the road to Jerusalem, erased from God's ledger. Murder, theft, rape, burned villages, slaughtered children, forgiven in advance. It was a license for atrocity stamped with the seal of Rome, and it transformed the men in that field. Peasants who had stolen bread became soldiers of Christ. Knights who had butchered their neighbors became pilgrims of the cross. The worst things a man could do were now the surest road to paradise. They were given 2 words to shout while they did it. Deus vult. God wills it. Those words would travel with them for the next 200 years. Screamed over villages, over caravans, over the dying in the streets of Jerusalem. Tell us in the comments what city and country you are watching from right now. And before we step into the madness, take a second to subscribe. Your support keeps these investigations into history's darkest hours alive. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. To understand the weapon Urban II forged in that field at Clermont, you have to first stand inside the forge. You have to feel the heat of the iron he was working with. 11th century Europe was not a land of banners and oaths and chivalrous knights riding to rescue maidens. It was a wound that had been refusing to close for generations. The whole social order rested on one cruel rule: primogeniture. The eldest son took everything: the castle, the fields, the title, the mill on the river, The peasants who worked the land and the right to judge them when they stole bread. Everything. For every heir who walked into his inheritance on his 18th birthday, 2 or 3 or 4 younger brothers walked out of the manor with nothing but a horse, a hauberk of riveted mail that weighed 30 pounds, a sword forged for one purpose, and the muscle memory of how to use it. They had been raised since boyhood for one thing: war. And now there was no war waiting for them. So they made their own. These men became a roaming sickness across the countryside of France, Lotharingia, and the German marches. They robbed pilgrims walking to Compostela. They burned the barns of peasants who could not pay their tolls. They sold their swords to whichever lord would feed them this week and killed for that lord against another lord the following month. They fought duels over insults nobody else could remember. The church tried to leash them. At the Council of Charroux in AD 989, then again at Narbonne in AD 1054, bishops declared the peace of God, protecting clergy and peasants and church property from violence. Then they added the truce of God, forbidding fighting on Sundays, on feast days, on the days of Christ's Passion. The knights ignored most of it. You do not tell a wolf which days it may hunt. Beneath this layer of armored predators lay something worse. The peasants themselves were dying. The decades before the Crusade became a slow apocalypse for the poor. The rains came when they should not have, then refused when they should. Crops failed in cycles. The chronicler Sigebert of Gembloux recorded famines so severe in the years AD 1085 and AD 1094 that whole villages emptied. People boiled tree bark for broth. Roots, clay. The monk Glaber, writing of an earlier famine, said the starving had begun digging up the recently buried. Mothers handed their children to passing strangers in exchange for a loaf of bread, telling themselves it was kindness. Then came the fire in the blood. They called it St. Anthony's fire because the monks of the Order of St. Anthony tended its victims at the hospital in La Motte-au-Bois. The cause, hidden from them, was a fungus called ergot that grew on damp rye in poor harvests. The grain made it into the bread. The bread made it into the people. The poison constricted their blood vessels. Their hands and feet burned as if held over coals. The skin blackened. The fingers separated at the knuckle. The mind broke open into visions of demons and screaming angels. Whole villages staggered through this together, certain that hell had reached up through the soil to claim them early. This was the Europe that heard the Pope's call on November 27, AD 1095. A continent of starving farmers who had nothing left to lose, and idle armored killers who had nothing left to gain at home. Dry kindling, soaked in oil, waiting for one spark. The man who lit it had not come to Clermont by accident. Urban II, born Odo of Châtillon in Champagne, had been a monk at Cluny before he was a pope. He understood the French nobility from the inside. He spoke their language. He had been preparing this speech for months, riding from town to town through southern France, taking the temperature of the lords as he went. He did not speak in Latin that day. He spoke in their own tongue. The platform had been built outside the city walls because no church in Clermont was large enough to hold the crowd. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, who claimed to be present, recorded the scene. Bishops in white, knights kneeling in the November mud, frost on the grass. Urban did not offer them theology. He offered them a transaction. He spoke of the suffering of Christians in the East, but he wrapped that suffering inside a sales pitch. The Holy Land, he told them, was a country flowing with milk and honey, a second Eden. For the landless second sons, he promised estates and titles carved out of foreign soil. For the starving farmer, he promised fields that produced without effort, vines heavy with grapes, herds without disease. Robert the monk, who wrote a version of the speech a decade later, recorded the line that broke the crowd. "From the lands you live in," Urban told them, "little flows but poverty. Go then. Wrest the holy places from a wicked race." It was the perfect manipulation. The reward shaped exactly to fit the hunger of whoever was listening. Eternal salvation in one hand, worldly riches in the other. Then he gave them the enemy. He described the Seljuk Turks as a race alien from God, a foul people defiling sacred ground, torturing pilgrims, desecrating altars. Most of it was rumor that had traveled west through Byzantine envoys. The emperor Alexios Pharnkomnenos had asked Urban for a few hundred mercenaries to help him take back Anatolia. Urban gave him a continent in arms. When he finished speaking, the crowd answered with two words that swept across the field like wind through wheat. Deus vult. God wills it. Men tore strips of red cloth from their cloaks and sewed crosses to their shoulders on the spot. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy was the first to kneel and take the cross. Within weeks, the news was running through every market town in France. What came pouring out first was not an army. A wandering preacher named Peter the Hermit took the message and turned it into a fever. He was a small man from Amiens, dirty, barefoot, riding a donkey through the towns of northern France. He held up a letter he claimed had fallen from heaven, written in God's own hand. He smelled, the chroniclers wrote, of sour wine and unwashed wool. People kissed the hem of his robe and tore hairs from his donkey to keep as relics. Tens of thousands followed him. Farmers, widows, beggars. Children who had never been more than 5 miles from their village. A few minor knights, men like Walter Sans-Avoir, drifted to the head of the column to give it some shape. They had no armor, no supply train, no plan. Only a cross stitched onto their tunics, and the certainty that God would feed them when the bread ran out. This was the People's Crusade. It became the first test of what Urban had unleashed, and it failed every test at once. They had to eat. The towns they passed through could not feed a moving city of perhaps 40,000 people. So they took. Their first conquests were the granaries and pantries of fellow Christians in the Rhine Valley. When they reached the Hungarian border at Semlin in June AD 1096, the looting grew so violent that King Koloman of Hungary sent his army to cut them down. Thousands died in the road before they had ever seen a Muslim. The blood on their hands at the start of the journey belonged to people who prayed to the same God. Then, before they ever reached the east, they found a closer target. The Rhineland was home to ancient Jewish communities. Old, prosperous, woven into the cloth and silver trades of Speyer, Worms, Cologne, Mainz, and Trier. They had lived there since the Roman legions had built the first walls along the river. As the Crusader bands moved north along the Rhine in the spring of AD 1096, a question began to pass from mouth to mouth in the ranks. Why march for 2 years to kill the enemies of Christ when there were unbelievers here, in these very streets, with gold sewn into their robes? A German noble named Emico of Leiningen took up that question and made himself its answer. He claimed a cross had been burned into his flesh by an angel. He gathered a column of perhaps 10,000 men and turned them on the Jews. In Speyer on May 3, AD 1096, the Bishop John sheltered most of the community in his own palace and executed crusaders in the marketplace to keep the rest of them in line. Speyer survived, more or less. 11 Jews were killed. Worms did not survive. The mob arrived on May 18th. They broke into Jewish houses one after another. They dragged out families into the dust of the street. They offered each one the same choice: be baptized, or be killed. Most refused. They were cut down on their own doorsteps. The synagogue burned. The Torah scrolls were torn apart and thrown into the river. The worst was Mainz. The Jewish community of Mainz had paid Archbishop Rothard a fortune in silver, perhaps 400 pounds, for his protection. He took the money. He brought them inside the walls of his own palace, sat them in his own banquet hall, and swore his guards would hold the line. Emicho's men arrived on May 25th, AD 1096. For 2 days they hammered at the palace gates with axes and beams. The defenders fired arrows down from the walls until they ran out of arrows. On May 27th, the gates broke. The archbishop ran. He took a side door, slipped down to the river, and rode across to a fortified house on the far bank. He left his soldiers behind, left his promises behind, left the families he had sworn to protect to face the men outside. Inside the courtyard, the community understood what was coming. Faced with the sword or the baptismal font, they chose neither. They chose a third path that the chroniclers, both Jewish and Christian, would record with horror for 1,000 years. The Hebrew chronicles of the Mainz Anonymous and Solomon Bar Simpson preserved what happened in that courtyard. Fathers gathered their sons. Mothers held their daughters. Knives that had cut bread the day before were drawn for a different work. Parents killed their children first, so the children would not see the Crusaders come through the door. Then husbands killed their wives. Then the survivors killed themselves. Rabbi Kalonymus ben Meshulam, the leader of the community, took his own son David into the cellar of the palace and ended the boy's life with his own hand before ending his own. A woman named Rachel of Mainz, the Chronicles record, killed her 4 children one by one and then sat in the courtyard with their bodies arranged around her until the Crusaders came for her too. When Emicho's men finally smashed through into the palace, they walked through halls that ran with blood that had not been shed by them. The survivors who had not been able to bring themselves to die were finished with axes and swords. More than 1,000 people died in Mainz that day. Similar massacres followed at Cologne, Trier, Metz, and Regensburg through the summer. The crusade was 6 months old. It had not yet reached the sea. The peasant army staggered on across the Bosphorus in early August AD 1096. Emperor Alexios met Peter at the docks of Constantinople, took one look at the column, and ferried them across the strait as quickly as possible to keep them away from his city. He warned them to wait for the professional army that was still coming. They did not wait. In the dry hills of Bithynia, near a town the Byzantines called Civito, they finally met what they had been marching toward: a real army. A column of Seljuk Turks under the command of Kilij Arslan, Sultan of Rum, mounted archers, disciplined officers. On October 21st, AD 1096, the Turks ambushed the Crusader camp at dawn. Anna Komnene, the emperor's daughter, recorded the slaughter in her Alexiad. The peasants were caught in the open, half of them still asleep. The battle lasted minutes. Peter the Hermit was conveniently away in Constantinople negotiating supplies. The rest were killed where they stood or roped together and sold in the slave markets of Anatolia within the week. Their bones were piled into a hill by the roadside that Byzantine travelers would still describe decades later as the Mountain of Crusaders. That was only the opening act. Behind the peasants came the real army, the army of the great lords. Roughly 60,000 men by some counts. Better mailed, better fed, better led, and far more dangerous. They crossed into Constantinople in waves through the winter of AD 1096 and into the spring of AD 1097. Alexios, watching them arrive, made each great lord swear an oath of loyalty before he ferried them across the Bosphorus. He understood, even if Urban did not, that what was coming into Asia was a force that could not be steered. They learned from the mistakes of the dead peasants. They did not learn mercy. They marched into the same furnace of hunger and fear, and the furnace did its work on them too. By the time they reached the Syrian coast, 3 years of road and siege had stripped them down to something harder than the men who had set out. The siege of Antioch nearly ended them. They reached the walls on October 21st, AD 1097. Antioch was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Its walls climbed the slopes of Mount Silpius and ran for miles. There were 400 towers. There were Christian churches inside, St. Peter's among them, and Muslim garrisons commanded by a Turkish governor named Yagi Siyan. 8 months the Crusaders sat outside. Through a winter so wet, the chronicler Raymond of Aguilers said the rain fell as if the sky had broken. Horses died of cold. Men deserted by climbing the cliffs above the camp in the dark. Then, on June 3rd, AD 1098, the city fell through betrayal. A tower captain named Firuz, an Armenian convert to Islam, lowered a rope from his section of wall for Bohemond of Taranto. The Normans climbed up in the dark. The gates opened from inside. The Crusaders slaughtered Yagi Siyan's garrison and most of the civilian population in a single night. The governor fled into the hills and was decapitated by a peasant who recognized him by his expensive boots. Then came the second siege. A Turkish relief army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived 4 days later. The Crusaders were now inside the walls, and Kerboga was outside. The food ran out within weeks. Horses were eaten first, then dogs, then leather belts boiled into broth, then nothing. The chronicler Fulcher wrote of men chewing the bark off trees inside the city walls. It was in this hollowed-out condition that a peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed a vision. He said the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross, was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter inside the city. They dug for hours. Raymond of Aguilers, who was present, wrote that just before nightfall, Peter himself jumped into the pit and pulled out a piece of rusted iron. Whether he had planted it or believed his own vision, the effect was the same. The discovery cracked the army's despair like a hammer hitting glass. On June 28, AD 1098, they marched out of the gates with the lance carried at the head of the column and broke Kerboga's army in a single afternoon. The Turks fled. The Crusaders took their camp and ate their supplies. After that, they were no longer soldiers. They were the army of God. Every massacre behind them became proof of their righteousness. Every horror became scripture. But the food was still not enough. A few miles south lay the Syrian city of Ma'arat al-Numan. They reached its walls in late November AD 1098. After a difficult siege of 2 weeks, the city fell on December 11th. The Crusaders slaughtered the inhabitants in the usual way, perhaps 20,000 people inside a single day and night. The army's supply situation had not changed. They were still starving. The countryside was scorched. And in the silence after the massacre, they crossed a line that no chronicler wanted to write down, but several of them did anyway. Radulf of Caen recorded it plainly. In Ma'ara, he wrote, "Our men boiled adult pagans in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and ate them roasted." Fulcher of Chartres, writing later and trying to soften the memory, admitted the same. He wrote that many of his people, driven mad by hunger, cut strips of flesh from the buttocks of Saracens already lying dead, cooked them, and when the meat was still raw at the center, devoured it anyway. Albert of Aachen confirmed it. The leaders of the Crusade later wrote a letter to Pope Paschal II, admitting that a horrible famine had forced their men to feed on the bodies of the Saracens. This was not one starving man losing himself in the dark. This was widespread, done by firelight in the open, recorded by their own side. Something had broken in them that would not grow back. The wall between man and monster, the one every culture builds and reinforces with ritual and rule, had been knocked down inside the army of God. It is in moments like Ma'ara, when you read the words written by the Crusaders' own scribes, that the real shape of this campaign comes into focus. A pilgrimage that ate its way to the holy city. Keeping these primary sources alive and reading them honestly is the work of this channel. We are not just retelling old stories. We are pulling the evidence back into the light. For those of you who feel this work matters, we have built an inner circle. We call it the lineage. Joining means more than watching. It means standing behind the research. It means helping us keep ancestral independent and free to tell the stories nobody else will touch. Members of the lineage get early access to new documentaries, exclusive material, and a direct line into what we are building next. If you believe in this work, click the Join button below and take your place in the ranks. The men who came out of Ma'ara were not the men who had ridden out of Champagne and Lorraine and Normandy 3 years earlier. The great lords could barely command them now. Godfrey of Bouillon, the silent duke who carried a relic of the true cross around his neck. Raymond of Saint-Gilles of Toulouse, the old wealthy cynic with one eye, who had pledged to die in the East and meant it. Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince who had come east not for God, but for a kingdom of his own, and who would peel off at Antioch to take that kingdom. Tancred, Bohemond's young nephew, ambitious and educated and already calculating his share. Robert of Flanders, Robert of Normandy, the son of William the Conqueror. They led an army that had walked through every kind of hell a man can walk through, and the army no longer feared anything on this earth. In early June of AD 1099, after 3 years on the road, the column came over a ridge in the Judean hills and stopped. The sun was high, the air was dry and smelled of dust and wild thyme. Cicadas droned in the olive trees. In the valley below, washed in the white summer light, sat the city they had been promised. Walls of pale limestone, the Tower of David rising at the western gate, the dome of the Holy Sepulchre, the dome of the Rock, the lines of cypresses along the Kidron Valley, Jerusalem. The men fell to their knees in the road and wept. Some kissed the dirt. Some pulled off their boots so they could walk the last miles barefoot, the way pilgrims should. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers wrote that even the hardest of them, men who had eaten the dead at Ma'ara, sobbed like children. Inside the walls, the Fatimid governor Iftikhar al-Dawla watched the kneeling army from the parapets. He had taken the city from the Seljuks only the year before. He had perhaps 1,000 soldiers and a population of around 40,000. He had expelled the local Christians a few weeks earlier to prevent a 5th column inside the walls. He had poisoned the wells around the city for miles. He had heard what happened at Antioch and at Ma'ara. He knew what was coming over that ridge. What none of them knew, on either side of those walls, was that what was coming would be worse than Ma'ara. Much worse. While the Crusader army was eating its way south through the Syrian summer, the city waiting for them at the end of the road was not a ruin. It was not an empty stage set for a holy reconquest. It was a working city, full of children and merchants and bakers and old men who had been born inside its walls and expected to die inside them. Jerusalem in AD 1099 had been under Muslim governance for 461 years, ever since the Caliph Umar took it from the Byzantines in AD 638. For most of those centuries, Life inside the walls had been ordinary. Taxes were paid, bread was baked, sons inherited their fathers' shops. The Christian pilgrims who arrived from Europe each Easter were taxed at the gate, given lodging in hospices funded partly by the merchants of Amalfi, and sent home with palm fronds and bottles of Jordan water. A pilgrim named Ceolwulf, who walked these same streets only 3 years after the events you are about to hear, recorded the lanes and lodgings in detail in his journal. In the year of the Crusade, the city had recently changed hands. The Fatimid Caliphate of Cairo, ruled by the boy Caliph al-Mustali and the powerful vizier al-Afdal Shahanshah, had taken Jerusalem back from the Seljuk Turks in August AD 1098, only 10 months before the Franks arrived. The Fatimids were Shia Muslims. The Seljuks were Sunni. The Crusaders did not know or care about the difference. They were marching to fight Turks. They would find themselves besieging a city held by Egyptians who had also just finished fighting Turks. The historian Ibn al-Athir, writing a century later in Mosul, noted the bitter irony. The Fatimids had even sent envoys to the Crusader camp at Antioch the previous winter, proposing an alliance against their common Seljuk enemy. The envoys returned with vague answers and a sense that something terrible was coming for them too. The streets inside the walls were narrow and roofed in places against the sun. The markets ran along the lines they had run along since Roman days, following the old Cardo down toward the Temple Mount. A merchant standing in the Souk al-Ataran, the perfumer's market, could hear Arabic, Persian, Greek, Armenian, Syriac, and Judeo-Arabic in the space of a few breaths. The streets smelled of saffron, of dust kicked up by donkeys, of olive oil burning in clay lamps, of the lye soap they made in the workshops near the Mamilla pool. Muslims prayed 5 times a day at the Dome of the Rock, the gold-roofed shrine built by the Caliph Abd al-Malik in AD 691, over the stone where Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven. They prayed at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the long silver-roofed hall at the southern end of the platform, rebuilt by the Caliph al-Zahir in AD 1035 after an earthquake had pulled it down. Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox and Armenian and Syriac and Georgian, worshipped at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rebuilt by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos in AD 1048, after the mad Caliph al-Hakim had torn it down a generation earlier in AD 1009. The Jewish community, smaller than it had been in antiquity but ancient nonetheless, kept its synagogue in the quarter near the southern wall and traded in cloth and silver and ink. The Cairo Geniza, a treasure of letters preserved in a synagogue storeroom in Old Cairo, contains the correspondence of these very families. Letters about marriage contracts, about shipments of indigo, about a sick aunt in Ramla. The last of those letters from Jerusalem stops in the spring of AD 1099. For these 40,000 people, Jerusalem was not a prize on a map. It was the alley they had played in as children. It was the cistern their grandfather had dug. It was the doorway where their mother had stood waiting for them at dusk. The man holding the walls of that home was named Iftikhar al-Dawla. His title meant pride of the state. He was not a fanatic. He was not a young man hungry for glory. He was a career officer of the Fatimid army, a Sudanese officer by some accounts, hardened by years of service on the Egyptian frontier where the Fatimids had been fighting Berber raiders and rebel tribes for decades. He had been receiving reports out of Syria since the previous autumn. Messengers had ridden in describing the fall of Antioch on June 3, AD 1098, the betrayal of Yagi Sian by the tower captain Firuz, the slaughter of Kerboga's relief force at the gates of the city on June 28. Then the reports from Ma'arat al-Numan had arrived in January, brought by Syrian refugees walking south barefoot. Iftikhar understood that whatever was walking south through Syria was not an army that obeyed any rule of war he had studied at Cairo. He had less than a year to prepare, possibly closer to 3 months once the route was certain. The Crusaders had spent the spring of AD 1099 detouring south along the coast, accepting tribute from the Fatimid governors of Tripoli and Beirut, taking food and silver and continuing south. Iftikhar received those reports too. He knew his own caliph was paying the men coming to kill him. He used the time the way a doctor uses a tourniquet on a wound that is going to cost a limb. He chose what to save and what to cut off. First, the water. The Judean hills in June are hot enough to crack stones. The temperature on the limestone reaches 40 degrees Celsius by mid-morning and stays there until sundown. Wells lay scattered across the countryside, dug over centuries by farmers and pilgrims and Roman engineers. Iftikhar sent work parties out for miles in every direction with orders to ruin them. Some they filled with stones. Some they fouled with the carcasses of dead animals. Some they collapsed entirely. The chronicler William of Tyre, Archbishop of the Crusader kingdom a century later, recorded that within a day's march of Jerusalem there was no clean water to be had. Only the pool of Siloam at the southeastern corner of the city still ran, fed by the Gihon spring through Hezekiah's tunnel cut in the rock 17 centuries earlier. That water flowed within bow-shot of his walls. Iftikhar wanted it that way. Second, the wood. He sent the same parties through the orchards. Olive trees that had been pruned by 4 generations of the same family came down. Fig trees, almond, mulberry, anything large enough to be cut into a beam. The Judean countryside in June already had little timber to give. Iftikhar took what there was. He was not just denying the Crusaders food. He was denying them the only material from which they could build the towers and rams that could reach the top of his walls. Third, the people. This was the cruelest decision, and the one he made knowing exactly what it meant. He could not feed the entire population through a siege of unknown length. He could not afford a single sympathetic gate opener inside the walls. So, in the weeks before the army arrived, he opened the gates and pushed the city's native Christians out. Greek Orthodox families, Armenian families, Syriac families, old men who had spent 40 years working in the same workshop, women carrying children too small to walk, out into the same poisoned countryside he had just created. They scattered toward Bethlehem and the coast, refugees from the city of their birth, expelled by a Muslim governor to be saved from a Christian army that would have killed them anyway because their beards were the wrong shape. He kept the soldiers he had, several hundred Arab cavalry, perhaps 400 Sudanese infantry, professional troops sent from Cairo, the militia of the local population, stockpiles of food sealed in the cellars of the citadel, naphtha, the petroleum incendiary the Fatimids extracted from the seeps near Hit on the Euphrates and stored in sealed clay pots. He sent a fast rider south to Ascalon, then on to Cairo, asking the vizier al-Afdal for a relief army. He knew the army would not arrive in time. He sent the rider anyway. On the morning of June 7th, AD 1099, the lookouts on the Tower of David saw the dust. It began as a smear on the northern horizon, the kind of smudge a herd of goats raises in summer. Then the smudge grew taller, and the lookouts understood what was inside it. The column came over the ridge slowly, in pieces, and resolved itself into men and horses, and the dull glint of iron in the dust. The sun was already high. The cicadas in the olive trees outside the wall had been screaming since dawn. It was not a magnificent army. 3 years and 3,000 miles had stripped it down. Of the 60,000 or more fighting men who had crossed the Bosphorus in AD 1097, perhaps 13,000 were still on their feet. 1,200 knights. The rest infantry and a few hundred sergeants. Their mail was orange with rust. Their surcoats had been mended so many times they were more patch than cloth. Their faces were burned black by the Anatolian sun above the line of the helmet and dead white below it. Many walked barefoot. They had eaten their horses in Syria and bought new ones from Arab traders along the coast. They drank from the same water skins they had carried since Antioch, leather gone hard and cracked. When the front of the column came in sight of the walls, the men stopped. They fell to their knees in the road. The sound that came from them was not a war cry. It was a low keening that built into open weeping. They tore their clothes. They pressed their faces into the dust. The Gesta Francorum, written by an anonymous Norman knight who marched with Bohemond, says they kissed the earth. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers, who walked at the head of the southern French column carrying the relic of the Holy Lance, wrote that even the hardest men in the army wept like children. For Iftikhar's soldiers on the wall, this was not a comforting sight. A regular army you could read. An army that wept at the sight of your walls was something else. The defenders had heard the reports out of Ma'ara. They knew these were the men who had cooked their dead enemies and eaten them. There was no negotiation possible with men in that state. The Crusader leadership divided the siege among them. Robert of Normandy, William the Conqueror's eldest son, took position opposite the Damascus Gate on the northern wall. Robert of Flanders set up beside him. Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Eustace of Boulogne, with the Lotharingian contingent, took the northwestern corner near the modern Jaffa Gate. The southern French, under Raymond of Toulouse and his bishop, Ademar's successor, William of Orange, settled on Mount Zion to the south, facing the Zion Gate. Tancred of Hauteville rode off with a small force to seize Bethlehem and returned with food. The army drew breath and looked at the walls. The first assault came too quickly. On June the 13th, the sixth day of the siege, a priest in the Crusader camp told the army he had received a vision. The hermit was named Peter Desiderius, attached to the southern French contingent. He claimed the dead bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, who had died at Antioch the year before, had appeared to him and said the city would fall if they attacked with faith and bare feet. The men believed him. They had to. They had nothing else. They charged across the open ground with one ladder. One, against walls 15 meters high and 3 meters thick at the base. They reached the foot of the wall and propped the ladder against the stone, and the first knights began to climb under a rain of arrows. The garrison on the parapet poured down naphtha. It clung to the wool of their surcoats. It clung to the leather of their boots. Water made it spread. A knight named Raimbold Croton from Chartres was among the first up the ladder. He lost a hand to a sword stroke at the top and fell back. He lived to be honored later, but the ladder did not. The Crusaders at the base of the ladder burned alive while their brothers above them died on arrows shot from yew-bows, drawn by men who had been practicing since childhood. The ladder was levered away from the wall with iron forks and crashed back with the men still on it. The whole assault lasted perhaps an hour. The garrison barely sweated. Then the heat began to do Iftikhar's work for him. The Crusaders had no water. The nearest source they had managed to find was the Pool of Siloam at the southeastern edge of the city, and it was within bowshot of the walls. Men trying to drink from it were shot in the back as they bent to fill their skins. The bodies bloated in the pool, and the water that the next men dipped out was already fouled. The army began traveling 6 miles to a spring at Ain Karim under armed escort. The wineskins and water bags they filled there leaked, fouled, and ran out long before they reached the camp. Raymond of Aguilers wrote that men sucked moisture from animal hides and chewed dirt for the dampness in it. Horses dropped where they stood and were eaten that night, raw, because there was no wood to cook them with. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, who was not at Jerusalem but compiled the reports from those who were, wrote of the camp at this point as a place of constant funerals. Knights who had survived Dorylaeum and Antioch and Ma'ara died of thirst in their tents within sight of the walls of the holy city. Men paid a silver denier for a single cup of water and drank it down and were thirsty again before the cup was empty. For 3 weeks, Iftikhar's strategy worked. The sun and the stones were killing his enemy without his soldiers losing a man. Then the news came up the road from the coast that ended the siege before the final assault had even begun. On June the 17th, 6 Genoese galleys under the brothers Guglielmo and Primo Embriaco had landed at Jaffa, 35 miles to the west. They had been part of the supply line working its way across the Mediterranean since the fall of Antioch the year before. The galleys carried rope, iron, nails, skilled carpenters and shipwrights from the Ligurian coast, men who had built warships for the Genoese Republic, and could now turn timber into anything that could be drawn on a wax tablet. The Crusader leadership sent a contingent of 300 knights down under the command of Geldemar Carpinel and Raymond Pillet to escort them up to the city. When a Fatimid fleet appeared off Jaffa and began to bottle up the harbor, the Embriaco brothers made a decision that doomed Jerusalem. They beached their galleys on the sand. They took them apart. They turned the hulls into lumber, and the masts into towers, and the rigging into the ropes that would haul those towers into position. They loaded everything onto carts and hauled the 35 miles inland through hill country still patrolled by Fatimid scouts. From the walls, the defenders saw the camp change overnight. The despair that had been creeping through it lifted. Frantic work replaced it. The sound that traveled across the valley to the wall was not chanting anymore. It was sawing, hammering, the steady tap of mallets on pegs, iron rings being driven through beams, Genoese voices shouting in a dialect the Fatimid Arabic speakers on the parapet could not understand, but could read in tone alone. Iftikhar understood immediately what was happening. The one thing he had denied them had arrived by sea. He sent another rider south to Ascalon with a more urgent message. He doubled the watches on the walls. 2 structures began to rise. The southern tower was built under Raymond of Toulouse on Mount Zion, opposite the southwestern wall near the Zion Gate. The northern tower, larger, was built by Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Eustace on the open ground north of the city. The man directing the engineering was a Genoese carpenter named Guglielmo Embriaco himself, the same man who had brought his own ship apart to make it possible. The towers grew in plain sight. There was no way to hide them, and no point in trying. Each tower stood roughly 16 meters tall. 3 stories of timber on wheels cut from solid sections of ship's mast. The lower story housed the crew that would push it, 40 to 50 men working blind beneath the structure. The middle story held archers and crossbowmen who would clear the parapet as the tower approached. The top story carried the drawbridge that would slam down onto the wall. The outer faces were nailed over with fresh ox hides and camel hides soaked in vinegar and urine, a treatment the Genoese knew would resist naphtha long enough for the tower to reach the wall. Smaller mangonels were built around the towers, counterweighted stone throwers that could fling rocks the size of a man's head into the masonry. a great battering ram, capped in iron at the head and slung from chains under its own roofed shelter, was assembled to break the outer barbican. Inside the city, the muezzins still called the prayers. The markets still opened, though with less food each day. A merchant in the Souk al-Ataran closed his shutters for the last time. A scribe in the Jewish quarter sealed his last letter to family in Ramla and gave it to a runner who would never reach the coast. The defenders watched the wood rise and counted the days they had left. Understanding what these machines actually were, how they were built, how they were rolled, how the men inside them lived and died, is not something you can get from a paragraph. The primary chroniclers of the siege, the Gesta Francorum, Raymond of Aguilers, Fulcher of Chartres, Albert of Aachen, and the Arab historians Ibn al-Athir and Ibn al-Qalanisi, who answered them, wrote down every beam and every bucket of vinegar. The book that anchored this entire investigation pulls those sources together into one volume, an archive of the medieval siege in all its mechanical horror. If you look at your screen right now, you can tap the View Products button and find it on the ancestral shelf. It is the key that unlocks everything you are watching. And while you are there, look at the themed relics we have curated to live alongside it. Pieces drawn from this era, designed to put the weight of this history into your hands. Open the shelf. Choose your relic. Arm yourself with the knowledge of what it cost to bring a city down. By the second week of July, both towers were nearly finished. They stood at the edge of the Crusader camp like wooden mountains, taller than the walls they were built to attack. The sound of hammering slowed, then stopped. Inside Jerusalem, the silence was worse than the noise had been. On July 8th, the Crusader leadership called a procession. Following the model of Joshua at Jericho, the entire army walked barefoot around the walls of Jerusalem. Priests carried relics at the front. Knights walked behind them in their patched mail. From the walls, the Fatimid garrison watched in confusion, and then in fury. According to Raymond of Aguilers, Muslim defenders on the parapets raised wooden crosses smeared with filth and spat on them as the procession passed below, taunting the Crusaders. The Crusaders saw the gesture and remembered it. There would be a debt for that. On the night of July 9th, Godfrey did something Iftikhar had not expected. Under cover of darkness, he had the entire northern tower disassembled, hauled half a mile east along the wall, and rebuilt on a stretch of the northern fortifications that Iftikhar had left lightly defended, because the ground there had seemed unsuitable for siege engines. The chronicler Albert of Aachen recorded that the work was done by torchlight, the timbers numbered with charcoal so the carpenters could reassemble them in the dark. By the time the sun rose on July 10th, the tower was standing in a position the defenders had never prepared for. Iftikhar's officers raced to redeploy mangonels and naphtha throwers to the new section of wall. They had hours, not days. In the city, the muezzin called the dawn prayer from the minaret of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In the Christian quarter, the few remaining Eastern Christians who had not been expelled hid in their houses behind doors barred with timber. In the Jewish quarter, families gathered in the main synagogue near the southern wall, as they always did when danger came. They had survived sieges before, the Romans under Titus in AD 70, the Persians under Khosrow II in AD 614, the Arabs under Umar in AD 638. They sat together on the cool stone floor, and they waited, and the children leaned against their mothers and slept. On the parapets, Iftikhar's soldiers loaded the mangonels with stones the size of bread loaves, and lit the braziers under the cauldrons of naphtha, and stared out at the two wooden towers waiting in the morning haze. The vinegar-soaked hides on the towers glistened in the new sun. Behind the towers, the Crusader priests began to chant in Latin. The words rolled across the dry ground toward the walls. Atamar's old chaplains, Peter Desiderius, Raymond of Aguilera with the Holy Lance held above his head. The defenders raised their crossbows along the wall and waited for the order. Inside the northern tower, on the top platform behind the drawbridge, Godfrey of Bouillon settled his helmet on his head and laid one hand on the lever that would drop the bridge. Then the first wheel turned. The wood groaned. The oxen hide creaked. The men beneath the structure pushed against the timbers with their shoulders. 16 meters of tower began to roll, slowly, across the broken ground toward the northern wall of the Holy City. On the parapet, Iftikhar al-Dawla, pride of the state, gave the order to fire. The end of Jerusalem began in the dark. On the night of July 13th, AD 1099, the Crusader camp moved like a single muscle. Torches were doused in pots of sand. Orders were passed by hand from tent to tent. To the south, on the slope of Mount Zion, Raymond of Toulouse pushed his tower toward the wall near the Zion Gate. The ground there was bad, broken with old terraces from vineyards the garrison had not yet cleared. The tower lurched and groaned, and the oxen hides on its flanks creaked against the timber. It moved slowly and loudly, and it was meant to. It was a hook for the attention of every soldier on the southern wall. Iftikhar al-Dawla took the bait the way a careful commander has to. He could not afford to ignore a 16-meter tower rolling toward his gate. He shifted his best men south. His mangonels, his stockpile of naphtha pots, sealed with wax and bedded in straw inside the cellars beneath the Tower of David. His Sudanese infantry under their captain. The northern wall, where the second tower had been built over the previous fortnight, was left in the hands of a thinner watch. In the dark, above the northern slope, Godfrey of Bouillon was already taking his tower apart. The chronicler Albert of Aachen recorded the work in his Historia Hierosolimitana, written from eyewitness reports gathered in the years after. Carpenters numbered each beam with charcoal. Genoese shipwrights under Guglielmo Embriaco rigged ropes through pulleys cut from the masts of their own beached galleys. Hundreds of men carried sections of the structure half a mile east along the wall to a stretch of fortification near what the Romans had once called the Porta Neapolitana, the gate the Crusaders would later rename the Damascus Gate. They reassembled the tower by lantern light, working with the heads of nails dampened in cloth to muffle the sound. The wind was with them. A breeze from the east carried noise away from the parapet. A kilometer behind them, Raymond's siege engines were still crashing against the southern wall and screaming under naphtha. When the sun rose on July 14th, the Fatimid sentries on the northern parapet looked out across the ground in front of them and saw a wooden mountain that had not been there at sunset. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing a century later in Mosul, noted the shock of that morning. Iftikhar's officers shouted men back to the northern wall. They dragged catapults across the city through streets too narrow for the work, leaving ruts in the limestone paving. They had hours. The tower already had its wheels turned. The assault began at first light on July 14th and did not stop for 36 hours. The first sound was the trebuchets. Counterweighted stone throwers on both sides flung blocks of limestone the weight of a man across the gap between the army and the wall. Each impact threw splinters of stone in every direction. The defenders on the parapet learned within minutes to keep their helmets low and their shields high. The mangonel crews inside the city threw back from the platform of the Temple Mount, the stones arcing over the roofs of the bazaars before crashing into the Crusader siege engines. The air between the wall and the tower filled with stone and the dust of broken stone. A knight named Aymery of Limoges, mentioned in passing by Raymond of Aguilers, was killed by a slab that came down on him while he braced a wheel. He was the first Crusader fatality of the day. Then, the arrows. The Genoese crossbowmen positioned in pavises around the towers fired bolts in volleys on whistled signals. The Fatimid archers on the wall answered with composite bows, shorter than the European yew, but faster to draw and reload. Raymond of Aguilera wrote that the sky over the northern wall was darkened with shafts at mid-morning. Men on both sides went down with arrows in the eye, the throat, the gaps between mail rings under the arm. The Crusader knight Eberhard of Le Puisay took a bolt through the cheek that he carried with him out of the city alive. Then the fire. The defenders had stockpiled their naphtha for months, distilled from the seeps near Hit on the Euphrates, and shipped down to Jerusalem in clay jars sealed with pitch. They lit braziers along the parapet. They dipped wicks of oil-soaked wool into the jars and threw them in long arcs at the approaching tower. Each pot that struck the hides sent a sheet of flame up the side of the structure. The vinegar-soaked hides held. The wood beneath them blackened, but did not catch. The men on the lower platform inside the tower poured water from skins along the inside of the boards to keep the seams cool. The smell was naphtha and burning hide and the iron taste of fear. Boiling oil came over the wall in cauldrons tipped onto the men working the wheels below. The chroniclers wrote of soldiers whose skin came away with their gauntlets when they tried to pull them off. A second tactic followed. The Fatimid garrison dragged two enormous timber beams to the wall, wrapped them in pitch-soaked rags, set them alight, and lowered them on chains in front of the advancing tower to block its path with a wall of burning wood. The tower stopped within 20 meters of the parapet. Both sides understood that whoever broke first lost the city. Godfrey's brother, Eustace of Boulogne, ordered water poured through gutters in the tower onto the burning beams below. A Lotharingian named Ludolf of Tournai climbed down with a hook on a chain to drag one of the beams aside. He was hit by an arrow in the shoulder and pulled himself back up the ladder with the chain still in his hand. For an entire day and a night, the defense held the line. Raymond's tower in the south died first. It had pushed across the broken ground of Mount Zion and dropped into the defensive ditch the Fatimids had cut at the foot of the wall, a trench 3 meters deep that the southern French had not properly filled. The wheels stuck. The structure tilted. The Fatimid garrison opposite, fighting under Iftikhar's direct command, concentrated their naphtha on the trapped tower. By the morning of July 15th, Raymond's tower was a smoldering frame slumped against the lip of the ditch. The southern French had spent themselves on a wall they could not reach. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers, who walked with his lord through the failed assault, wrote that the men around him wept from exhaustion and shame. Godfrey's tower in the north kept rolling. The fighting at the wall reached the kind of close work that strips a man down to his hands and his teeth. Defenders extended long iron grappling hooks fastened to poles, hoping to catch the tower's upper frame and lever it sideways. Crusaders inside the tower hacked at the poles with axes. Men on the parapet swung two-handed swords at hands that reached over the stone. The Gesta Francorum records that on the morning of July 15th, the defenders hung the bodies of 2 Crusaders who had been killed the day before from the parapet by their ankles, a taunt and an attempt to draw fire away from the tower's approach. Godfrey ordered his crossbowmen to shoot the corpses down so they could be buried. In the streets behind the walls, the city was already preparing for the worst. The Fatimid garrison had ordered the doors of the Temple Mount closed. Civilians had begun to gather inside the platform, climbing the steps from the Bab al-Silsila and the Bab al-Asbat with whatever they could carry. The muezzin had not called the noon prayer because the parapet near the minaret was under fire. In the Jewish quarter, near the southern wall, the elders had gathered in the main synagogue. They sat on the stone benches as their fathers had sat through the siege of AD 1071, when the Seljuks had come, and as their grandfathers had sat through the persecutions of al-Hakim 70 years before that. Then the wind shifted. It is the detail every chronicler of the siege fixes on, because it changed everything. A breeze had been coming from the east, blowing the smoke of the burning naphtha back toward the Crusader Tower. Around midday on July 15th, the wind turned and began to blow from the west. The smoke that had been smothering the attackers now rolled back over the parapet into the faces of the defenders. The Fatimid soldiers on the wall coughed and turned away, and lowered their bows to wipe their eyes. The chronicler, Albert of Aachen, credited the wind to divine intervention. The Arab historian al-Azimi, writing in Aleppo a generation later, recorded the wind in his chronicle without comment, as if simply noting a fact too important to pretend away. In that gap of seconds, Godfrey's tower closed the last meters. A crusader inside the upper platform cut the ropes holding the drawbridge. The bridge fell across the gap between the tower and the stone of the parapet with a sound the chronicles describe as a thunderclap. Albert of Aachen names the first two men across as Litold and Engelbert of Tournai, two Flemish brothers in the service of Godfrey. They went over the parapet with their swords drawn and cut down the men still trying to clear their eyes. Behind them came Godfrey himself in mail darkened by smoke. Behind him came his brother Eustace. Behind them came a knight named Bernard of Saint-Valery, who would later swear under oath that he saw Godfrey kill 3 men in the first minute on the wall. A foothold on the wall is not a city, but a foothold on the wall is the beginning of a city's death. The knights worked east and west along the parapet, clearing the wall section by section. The defenders fought back where they could, but the smoke had broken their lines. A smaller party of crusaders fought down a stone staircase to the gate below. They cut the bars with axes and pulled the doors open from the inside. The infantry that had been waiting in formation outside the wall came through the gate at a run. The hour, according to the Gesta Francorum, was the 9th hour, which the chronicler considered significant. It was the hour at which the Gospels said Christ had died on the cross. By sunset on July 15th, the army was inside Jerusalem. What followed was not a battle. The chroniclers themselves were clear about that. The Fatimid garrison's professional corps, perhaps 400 Sudanese infantry, and a handful of Arab cavalry under Iftikhar, fell back to the Tower of David at the western edge of the city, the only fortification inside the walls strong enough to hold against the Crusaders for any length of time. Iftikhar sent a messenger out under a white cloth. He offered the citadel and a large quantity of silver to Raymond of Toulouse in exchange for safe passage out of the city for himself and his remaining men. Raymond accepted. The deal was honored. Iftikhar and his garrison were escorted out of the Jaffa Gate under Crusader guard at first light on July 16th and rode south toward Ascalon. They were the only Muslim defenders of Jerusalem who lived. Iftikhar himself reached Cairo. His report to the vizier al-Afdal, paraphrased in the later Arab chronicles, was brief. He said the Franks had not fought like men. For everyone else inside the walls, there was no negotiation. The killing was organized. It was not the chaos that follows a battle. It was a sweep. The Crusaders moved through the city in working parties under their lords, street by street, breaking doors with the pommels of their swords. They went into houses where families had barred themselves inside, and they came out alone. They went down into cellars with torches. They pulled people out of cisterns and granaries. They cut throats over thresholds. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, who arrived in Jerusalem the following December as part of the army that came to consolidate the conquest, wrote that he had to hold a cloth to his face for weeks because the bodies were still being collected. Raymond of Aguilers walked through the city on the morning of July the 16th and wrote down what he saw. His account was meant to celebrate the victory. It reads now as something else. He wrote of piles of heads, hands, and feet in the streets. He wrote that it was necessary to pick a path over the bodies of men and horses. He wrote that at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders called the Temple of Solomon, where thousands of civilians and a portion of the garrison had fled for sanctuary, the soldiers rode through blood that reached the knees of their horses and the bridles. The Gesta Francorum, written by an anonymous Norman in the army of Bohemond, gives the same image. Fulcher of Chartres, writing from second-hand reports, also confirms it. Modern scholars have argued that the bloodline is biblical typology drawn from the Book of Revelation, where the winepress of God's wrath produces blood up to the horses' bridles. The chroniclers wrote in the language they knew. What the language was reaching for was a reality their vocabulary could not contain. The number of dead has been argued over for 9 centuries. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir wrote 70,000. Modern historians have argued for figures lower than that, in the tens of thousands. Recent letters recovered from the Cairo Geniza, the document storeroom of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo, were written by Jewish refugees in the weeks after the city fell. Solomon ben Judah of Fustat wrote to a relative in Alexandria that of the Jewish community of Jerusalem, only a small number had been ransomed and taken to Ascalon. The rest, he wrote, were gone. 2 acts inside that slaughter stand apart, not because they were worse than the others, but because they were chosen. The Jewish community of Jerusalem fell back to the main synagogue near the southern wall when the gates broke. They had survived this way before. The Romans under Titus had taken Jerusalem in AD 70, and the community had survived. The Persians under Khosrow II had taken it in AD 614, and the community had survived. The Arabs under Umar had taken it in AD 638, and the community had survived. They sat on the cold stone floor of their synagogue and waited for the violence to pass. The Crusaders did not break the doors. They piled wood from the orchards they had not yet burned around the foundation of the building. They blocked the exits with timber. They lit the wood. The synagogue burned with everyone inside still alive. The chronicles record that the knights outside the burning building sang the hymn, "Christ, we adore thee," while the screaming continued from within. The letters from the Cairo Geniza, written by survivors who reached Egypt months later, mention the synagogue burning by name. One letter requests funds from the Egyptian community to ransom Torah scrolls that had been taken from the city by Crusaders who understood they were valuable. The scrolls were eventually bought back. Most of the people who had owned them were not. The second act belongs to Tancred of Hauteville, nephew of Bohemond and one of the youngest of the great lords. When the Al-Aqsa Mosque was overrun on the evening of July 15th, several hundred civilians had taken refuge on its flat roof, climbing up through the trap doors with whatever they could carry. Some sources put the number at 300. Some say more. Tancred reached the roof with his men and took their surrender. He gave them his banner as a token of protection. Tancred's banner over the roof meant that no man under his authority would harm them. He left the banner flying and went down into the rest of the city. On the morning of July 16th, a different group of Crusaders climbed onto the roof. They had heard the people up there carried gold. They ignored Tancred's banner. They worked across the roof from one side to the other and killed every person on it. Tancred, when he heard, was reported to be furious. Whether the fury came from broken honor or from the loss of ransom money, the chronicles do not agree. He never named the men who did it. They were never punished. After 2 days, the killing slowed, because the supply of people to kill had run low. The city the Crusaders had marched 3 years to redeem was a silence, broken only by flies. The summer heat worked on the bodies in the streets and inside the houses. The chronicler William of Tyre, born in Jerusalem in the next generation, wrote a century later that older men in the city still remembered the smell. It carried beyond the walls for miles. The chronicles of survivors who reached Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo in the following weeks all recorded the same thing. The streets were impassable for the dead. The final scene of the siege has been argued about for 900 years. The chroniclers who recorded it did not see anything strange in it. The princes washed. They went down to the cisterns and the pools that still held water inside the city. They stripped off the mail that was stiff with the dried blood of strangers. They cleaned themselves at basins of cool stone. They dressed in white linen robes that they had carried for 3 years for this moment, folded carefully in the bottoms of their saddlebags through the Anatolian winter and the siege at Antioch and the famine at Ma'ara. They walked barefoot through the streets of the city they had taken, past the bodies they had made, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They knelt at the tomb where they believed Christ had been buried. They prayed. They wept. Raymond of Aguilers wrote that the day was made joyful by the tears of the soldiers. They were not tears of guilt. They were tears of arrival. They had reached the end of the road Urban had pointed them down in Clermont 4 years earlier. They believed the work they had done in the streets that morning was the work God had sent them to do. This was the meaning of the indulgence Urban had offered in AD 1095. The promise that every sin committed on the road would be erased. They had taken him at his word. They walked away from the bodies of tens of thousands of people and into a church, and they did not believe they had sinned. The chronicler Eckhard of Ora, a German monk who came to Jerusalem in AD 1101 on a pilgrimage funded by his own abbey, wrote that the survivors of the original army he met in the city spoke of the massacre as a sacrament. Godfrey of Bouillon was elected to rule the city 8 days later, on July 22nd. He refused the title of king. He would not wear a crown of gold, he said, in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He took instead the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. He died of illness on July 18th, AD 1100, less than a year after the conquest, possibly of typhoid contracted in the same fouled water supply the Fatimids had once tried to deny him. His brother Baldwin, who had taken the city of Edessa for himself the year before, came south, took the crown Godfrey had refused, and was anointed King of Jerusalem on Christmas Day, AD 1100 in Bethlehem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was founded over the bones of its previous inhabitants and lasted, in one form or another, for the next 188 years. The Fatimid relief army that Iftikhar had sent for arrived 3 weeks too late. The vizier al-Afdal Shahanshah marched up from Egypt with 20,000 men and met the Crusader army at Ascalon on August 12, AD 1099. He had not expected the Crusaders to come out to meet him. They came out. They broke his camp at first light. Al-Afdal escaped into the city of Ascalon and from there back to Cairo. He would spend the next 19 years of his life trying to take Jerusalem back. He would never see it again. Saladin would do it. In AD 1187, 88 years and 3 months after Godfrey's tower came across the wall, Urban II died in Rome on July 29th, AD 1099, 14 days after the city fell. The news had not yet reached him. He died believing the army he had sent into the east had failed. The crusade he had launched as a way to drain the violence of Europe into a foreign country did exactly what he had designed it to do. The knights who survived did not come home. They stayed and carved out kingdoms along the Levantine coast, 4 Crusader states stretching from Edessa in the north to the Sinai border in the south. The peasants did not come home either. Most of them were buried in foreign ground long before the army reached Jerusalem. The men who had wept in the dust of the road 3 years earlier had become the men who burned the synagogue. The men who had taken the cross at Clermont had become the men who rode through the streets of the Temple Mount on horses that walked through blood. The promise Urban had made in the field outside the city of his birth had been kept. Every sin was forgiven. The ledger had been cleared. The men in the white robes inside the Holy Sepulchre had been told they were saints. They believed it. The story did not end at Jerusalem. It began there. For the next 200 years, every act of violence committed across the eastern Mediterranean by men carrying a cross stitched to their shoulder traced its lineage back to that field at Clermont and that windshift on July 15th, the Children's Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, and the sack of Constantinople, the Albigensian Crusade against fellow Christians in southern France, the Northern Crusades against the pagans of the Baltic. The pattern Urban had drawn on a field in Auvergne kept printing itself across centuries, in cities that would not be built for another 200 years, in languages he had never heard spoken. Thank you for staying with this investigation to the end. If this story has changed the way you see this part of history, leave a comment with the name of the chronicler, whose words you will not forget, whether Raymond of Aguilers, or Ibn al-Athir, or Solomon ben Judah of Fustat. Subscribe to Ancestral and share this with one person who deserves to know what really happened inside those walls in July of AD 1099. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. A new investigation is appearing on your screen right now. The next step in your descent through the darkest chapters of the human record. Click it and keep walking.